This is the heart of Malaya, mountains and jungles which for thousands of years have resisted the advance of civilization cover the greater part of the country. In the jungle live the tribes of the Sakai, the original inhabitants of the peninsula. These people still pursue their primitive ways of living. Their principal weapon is still the blowpipe and poison dart, with which they kill small animals to supplement their daily diet of rice and vegetables. The tree rat is often one of their quarries. The dart is placed in the tube with a small wad of palm fluff pushed in behind it. The poison used is taken from the upas tree and is strong enough to kill the animal, but not strong enough to harm the people who will eventually eat it. The Sakais are still a nomadic race. One of their principal means of travel is by raft, which they propel along the swiftly running streams. The women of the village come down to collect water in hollow bamboo stems. They carry the water back to the houses, which are built on stilts as a protection against wild animals. The Sakais plant their crops in clearings in the jungle and move on to fresh encampments when the soil has become exhausted. They lead a communal life, the work and possessions of all the tribe being shared by everybody. They cook their food in hollow bamboo stems. The food usually consists of rice, which they grow, and vegetable roots, which they dig up in the jungle. Occasionally they add to these a little salted fish. The fire on which this food is cooking was made by friction. These young men are practicing this difficult task. Thin strips of wood are rubbed vigorously against a piece of bamboo. The heat made by this method lights a small piece of palm fluff, and this, together with some straw, forms the basis of the fire. This is a village of the Sakai, the first of the 5 faces of Malaya. The Malays themselves are descended from the Sakai, Mongols and southern Indians. With their love of pomp, they have adopted many ceremonies from the ancient rituals of India. His Highness the Sultan Selangor is holding an investiture in his palace of Klang, surrounded by his court officials and the women of his household who look on discreetly from the stairway. His Highness is receiving homage from his new chieftains. Each chief has to perform a certain series of movements, and if he makes a mistake, he becomes an object of ridicule, one of the most serious things that can happen to a Malay. The chiefs lay their krises on the floor in token of submission and loyalty to the Sultan. The early Malays were fisher folk who settled on the coast, building their houses among the palm trees close to the water's edge. Today, the sea and the fertile fringe of land provide their descendants with all they need. The Malays are indolent and optimistic, satisfied with a carefree, easy life in the sun. Today, as their people have done for hundreds of years, they sit on the seashore, gossiping and mending their nets. They penetrated slowly into the densely forested country, paddling their canoes up through the mangrove swamps which line the west coast, across the still, dark water, past the tangle of trees on the mud banks. Inland, they fish on the broad rivers, using weighted casting nets and keeping a wary eye for crocodiles. Most Malays still use primitive methods of agriculture. To irrigate their rice fields, they build water wheels which are turned by the stream. Wooden scoops carry the water up to a trough, along which it runs to the rice fields nearby. At harvest time, the whole village works in the fields. The reaping, like so much of the work in Malaya, is done by the women. Sometimes each head of rice is cut separately so that nothing shall be wasted and so that the soul of the plant shall not be offended. The men are gathering the stalks and threshing them, a more wasteful but quicker process. In the village, the women pound the rice by means of this primitive wooden machine. After it has been pounded, the rice is weighed. Thus the Malays, the second race we meet in the peninsula, live their lives much as they did in the days before the first Europeans sailed down the coast of Malaya in the 13th century. But it wasn't until 300 years later that the country was really visited by Europeans. The Portuguese, sailing out on the last of the great crusades against the Mohammedans, were the first to land at the harbour of Malacca in 1509. They were captained by Diego Lopez de Sequeira. The Malays thought that the Portuguese were white Indians and crowded round them, pulling their beards to see if they were real. But later the Malays attacked them, and de Sequeira had to sail away. 2 years later, Alfonso d'Albuquerque came to avenge this insult to Portugal and besieged the town. Most of the trade from the east came through Malacca, and its rich cargoes of spices were especially coveted by Europeans. D'Albuquerque captured the town and built there a great fortress and a church, the ruins of which stand to this day. It was here that St. Francis Xavier lived for many years, converting the people to the Catholic faith and performing many miracles. But troubles in Europe weakened Portugal's power, and in 1641 the Dutch, aided by the Sultan of Johor, besieged the city, which once again fell, and the Dutch established there one of the headquarters of their East India Company. But the wealth of the peninsula continued to be exploited. Ivory and tin, gold and rich spices, pepper, saffron, cloves, and much prized things such as rhinoceros horns and bezoars. But in 1795, Malacca reverted to the British. Nine years earlier, Francis Light hoisted the British flag on Prince of Wales Island, which is now called Penang. But it wasn't until Sir Stamford Raffles came on the scene that the story of the Straits settlements as a British possession began. One of the greatest, wisest and most humane of our empire builders, he foresaw the potential importance of Singapore. In 1819, when he persuaded the British to buy it from the Sultan of Johor, it was a derelict fishing village. He realized its importance and strategic possibilities and foretold the day when it would be one of the chief cities of the East. Today, steamers sail swiftly through the entrance to Singapore harbour, past islands which were once the haunts of pirates. Wang Tai-yuan, a Chinese trader, writing in 1349, said,
"When the Chinese junks come back from the Western Sea, they get out their armour and padded screens, for of a certainty 200 or 300 pirate ships will come out from the villages to attack them."
The pirates were not finally swept from the sea until less than 100 years ago. Raffles' words have come true. Ships of all kinds from every part of the world bring their rich cargoes safely to Singapore, the Lion City. Singapore is the base of the British Navy and Air Force in the East. Its wharves deal with the commerce of the world. But its prosperity has not been built up only on the profits from shipping. The country possesses products of far greater value, one of these being tin. The Malays, content with their lot in the sun, would not sweat and toil to dig riches from the ground. But there was a people whose living conditions in their own country were such that they would travel far abroad to gain their daily rice. These were the Chinese, who came in their thousands to labor in the tin mines and formed the third of the 5 faces of Malaya. Malayan tin is cheap to produce, being easily accessible. The Kerang or tin-bearing soil is cut out of the earth by these laborers whose kongsis or guilds are as strong and efficient as any trade union. There are several methods of getting tin from the earth, and this is the first one. The earth is beaten away by the force of the water, washed to the level of the mine, and sucked up by these pipes. By whichever method tin is obtained from the earth, by digging, by dredging, or by hydraulic power, it must always be taken up to a height. 50% of the world's output of tin comes from these mines. Tin to hold your canned food, to make armaments, to wrap your cigarettes. The water runs down over these sluices and the soil is carried away. The heavier particles of tin sink to the bottom, and after they have been washed and dried, they are loaded into sacks and taken to the smelting works. In 1849, 22 rubber seedlings brought from Brazil and nursed by the experts at Kew Gardens were taken to Malaya and planted as an experiment. The descendants of these 22 seedlings now cover 3.5 million acres. Thousands of Tamils from the Madras Presidency of India came across the sea to tend the plantation and make the 4th of the 5 faces of Malaya. Working swiftly and silently, the Tamils make cuts in the trunks of the trees. From these cuts, the liquid, milk-like rubber flows into small bowls. Half the world rides and walks on Malayan rubber. The rubber in the cups is collected by the women and taken to the factory. Here, the rubber is coagulated in a solution of acid and allowed to set. It is then run through rollers and pressed into thin sheets. These sheets are hung out in the sun to dry. Wealth needs protection.
Squad! Unfixed! Ladies!
The recently formed Malay Regiment, which is officered by Malays, is the newest unit in the regular defence forces of the Empire. The British were the fifth race to settle in the country, and they brought it its peace and prosperity. They have, as usual, carried with them their own background. Side by side with the golf clubs and swimming pools are the streets of the Chinese people. Round the corner from the clubs, washing is hanging out in the streets to dry. Such towns as Kuala Lumpur, Taiping and Ipoh have been created largely by a prosperity which is based on tin and rubber. But the old ways of living continue. The rickshaw driver still plies for hire, sweating between the shafts. He runs along the waterfront at the foot of the great buildings where new industries are being planned. Tea has been successfully introduced into the country. The plantations are tended by Tamil labour, and only world economic conditions prevent Malayan tea from becoming a great industry. Pineapples brought by the Portuguese from Mexico 400 years ago come in vast quantities to England, over 100 million cans being exported every year. The old industries are being modernized. Copra, which is obtained from the coconut, is the third most important of the country's products. Deep in the jungle are many varieties of valuable timber. The Malays will work at jobs which require skill and which are exciting and interesting. They climb the trees, building their ladders as they go, putting up the wooden rods and hammering in the cross pegs to form steps. Sitting astride the boughs, they strip the trees for felling. Medicine and sanitation are conquering the diseases of the tropics. Modern communications have brought Malaya within 8 days of London by air. The water power of Malaya is being harnessed to provide electricity for the development of the country. The Sultans of Malaya have adopted Western ideas. His Highness the Raja of Perak, Sultan Iskandar, famous polo player, was educated at Oxford. The Sultan of Pahang, the ruler of a large estate, plays tennis with an official. The children of Malaya are being educated. Early in the morning, they walk sedately along the road towards the school.
Platoon. On the left, form, platoon.
Police are recruited from among the Malays. These people ago had never heard of discipline nor dreamt of cooperation, now provide protection for themselves as well as for the rest of the inhabitants of the country. The Malays' love of ritual, which is seen in their traditional ceremonies, finds a new outlet in drilling on the parade ground. The police are trained at a central depot in Kuala Lumpur before being sent out to keep order in the towns and villages. At the same time, the old traditions of Malay continue. The ruler of Negri Sembilan, called to the bar in London in 1928, maintains the traditions and customs of his people, walking under the umbrella which is a symbol of royal state. The Mohammedan faith still strengthens and upholds the Malay in his daily life. Every Friday the people go to the mosque to learn the teachings of the Quran and of the Prophet Muhammad. The Malays are happy and contented in their villages, which are scattered all over the country, some on the coast and some far inland in the jungle. The women still carry home the rice from the fields, the ox is led to pasture, fruit orchards flourish near the houses, the cart rumbles slowly along the road to the town. Western ideas haven't altered the old customs. A Malay wedding is celebrated on 2 different days. The bride is not present at the first ceremony, which is the actual marriage, but is represented by her nearest male relative. 2 or 3 days later, the bridegroom and his friends come to claim the bride. Now is the time for feasting and enjoyment. Bride and bridegroom sit under awnings attended by the women of the village. In front of them a tree is placed bearing eggs which are to be distributed among the guests to bring them luck. While they sit here they must keep straight faces in spite of their friends who stand round laughing and joking, shouting rude remarks at them and generally doing all they can to make them embarrassed. The bride and groom feed each other with yellow rice in token that they will always be faithful and help each other. I lose a pearl, amid the grass it keeps its hue, though low it lies. I love a girl, but love will pass, a pearl of dew that slowly dies. The character of the Malays is well expressed by his games, at which he likes to excel. A game which is popular in certain parts of Malaya is the rock slide called Mengalungcho. The men sit on banana leaves and slide down across the rocks, guiding themselves with their hands and feet, trying to steer straight through the first pool at the bottom into the second. Sir Stamford Raffles said, "There is something in the Malay character which is congenial to British minds. There is a spirit of personal independence and a high sense of honour which distinguishes these people." His words are true today. Another game, Separaga, is played with a hollow wicker ball which is kicked high into the air by the players, the object being to keep the ball from dropping onto the ground for as long as possible. There is also a kind of boxing match known as basilat, in which each man tries to touch his opponent's body whilst at the same time protecting his own. The principle is similar to that of fencing, but the hands and feet are used instead of weapons. The famous Malay ronggeng is a mixture of Sakai and Hindu dances. The music has been handed down from the days of the Portuguese, who brought it from Europe in the 16th century. The dance is a very sociable affair in which the whole village takes part. The women are generally professional dancers, and their job is to dance for the whole evening and give the men an opportunity to show off their steps. This old woman sits and watches to see that the dancing is carried on with decency and modesty. Only the fringe of the Malay Peninsula is inhabited. Behind the cultivated areas there are still jungles and mountains, vast tracts of land which are only just beginning to be exploited. 4 of the 5 faces of Malaya are slowly encroaching on the jungle. The Tamils from Madras planting rubber as the jungle is cleared. The Chinese penetrating into the interior in their search for tin. And the British, whose administration furthers these developments. The Sakais in the jungle retreat slowly before this inevitable invasion. 5 races, each one with traditions, faiths and customs of its own, live in harmony in one country. They do not encroach upon each other. They all lead their separate lives, each one respecting the beliefs and customs of the other. The Malay remains unchanged. He makes no great demands of life. He does not clamour for recognition, but by force of personality he retains his identity amidst all these invaders and plays his own part in the progress of Malaya.